There is a dangerous misconception that many people hold about empathetic individuals. They assume that soft hearts mean fragile minds, that patience equals passivity, and that forgiveness is just another word for surrender. They mistake emotional kindness for emotional blind spots, failing to realize a fundamental truth about human nature. Empaths are not delicate simply because they feel life with immense depth. They are actually remarkably resilient, surviving emotional storms that would completely shatter most people. The moment you push an empathetic person beyond their final boundary, something transforms permanently. It does not happen with screaming dramatic scenes or sudden chaotic outbursts. It happens quietly, coldly, and irreversibly. The most dangerous version of an empath is never the emotional one, but the emotionally detached one. You see, highly empathetic people are constant observers of human behavior. Even when they sit in complete silence, they are taking in every single detail around them. They notice tiny shifts in your tone, subtle changes in energy, performative concern, hidden disrespect and manipulation wrapped up as affection. They catch what others miss because high emotional intelligence sharpens the brain to spot inconsistencies instantly. That is why empaths often stay quiet longer than expected. They are not ignorant of what you are doing, but rather processing the truth and collecting emotional clarity before taking their final step. Most people believe an empath keeps forgiving because they are naive, but that is completely wrong. Empaths usually see the reality of a situation long before they ever bring it up. They simply hold out hope that people will choose honesty and maturity before the damage becomes permanent. However, repeated emotional distress fundamentally alters human psychology, especially for someone who processes feelings with intense clarity. At first, an empath will try everything to communicate openly. They will explain their feelings, attempt to fix broken bridges, ask thoughtful questions, and seek deep mutual understanding. Intellectually mature individuals naturally search for solutions before choosing total separation. But when genuine care is repeatedly met with deceit and games, the brain shifts into survival mode. This is where the true transformation begins, so pay very close attention to what happens next. Slowly, the empath stops reacting. Most people completely misinterpret this specific phase, assuming the person is finally calming down or accepting the situation. In reality, there is a massive psychological difference between inner peace and an emotional shutdown. Peace still holds warmth, while shutdown carries pure distance. Once emotional detachment sets in, the connection has already entered its final moments, and there is almost nothing left to save. Human relationships survive purely through active emotional investment. The moment an empath stops investing their energy, the underlying structure collapses without a sound. What makes this so striking is that many manipulative people only feel powerful when they can trigger intense reactions. They feed on emotional access, arguments, begging, crying, and desperate explanations. These reactive behaviors reassure them that they still hold complete power over the room. But when the empath suddenly turns quiet and composed, something deeply uncomfortable happens. Control vanishes instantly. The manipulator can no longer predict or direct the empath's responses. And that unpredictability creates massive anxiety. That is why harmful people often become far more aggressive when an empath goes silent. Your silence completely removes their influence. This is an important psychological truth to understand. People become deeply disturbed when their control over you disappears. Empaths eventually reach a point where they no longer seek validation from the people causing them harm. That single realization changes everything, because an emotionally detached empath is practically impossible to manipulate. They step entirely out of the game you thought you were playing. Understand this clearly. Empaths do not turn heartless after going through pain. They simply become extremely selective with their energy. That is the critical difference you must grasp. Pain acts as a powerful teacher of pattern recognition. After experiencing enough betrayal, an empath stops ignoring obvious red flags. They stop over-explaining themselves to people who refuse to listen, stop chasing closure from dishonest sources, stop forcing artificial connections, and stop trying to rescue individuals who secretly enjoy causing destruction. This sudden evolution shocks everyone around them. Why does it hit so hard? Because people become deeply addicted to the rare emotional safety that empaths naturally provide. Empaths listen with genuine focus, support consistently, forgive generously, and offer deep understanding. Most people never appreciate the true worth of that presence until it completely disappears from their life. When that energy vanishes, the entire atmosphere changes immediately. The warmth disappears, the constant reassurance ends, and the deep emotional availability evaporates. Many people experience an intense form of emotional withdrawal without even realizing why it is happening. They were consuming a level of care they never truly valued. Breaking an empath almost always leads to deep regret down the line. This regret does not happen because the empath seeks revenge, but because their complete absence exposes what their presence was protecting you from all along. It exposes underlying loneliness, emotional confusion, a lack of real understanding, and a deep internal emptiness. The empath was carrying heavy emotional weight silently the entire time, and once they put it down, everyone finally feels how heavy it actually was. There's another major mistake people make. They think deeply feeling people cannot become emotionally disciplined. In reality, the exact opposite is true. The deepest feelers often become the sharpest observers because pain refines their awareness. An empath who survives betrayal develops extraordinary self-control. Over time, they learn exactly who drains their battery, who manipulates sympathy, who lies using surface charm, and who performs kindness for strategic gains. Once these patterns become visible, the empath becomes nearly impossible to trick ever again. This is where emotional maturity evolves into pure, quiet power. It is not loud or theatrical, but composed and grounded. It is the power that no longer needs outside approval, the power that walks away without long explanations, knowing silence speaks louder than any argument. When an emotionally evolved empath walks away, manipulative personalities find them deeply intimidating. Manipulation only works on people who are desperate for connection or validation. A healed empath is no longer emotionally desperate. They know how to love deeply without ever abandoning themselves in the process, and that balance changes everything. Now, here is the part that most people are simply not prepared to face. When an empath finally stops caring, it means they cared far too much for far too long. Emotional shutdown rarely happens overnight, out of nowhere. It occurs after repeated disappointment, continuous disrespect, ongoing emotional imbalance, and broken promises. Eventually, the human nervous system protects itself by drastically lowering emotional attachment. Psychologists recognize this state as emotional withdrawal, following prolonged stress exposure. Once this state fully takes hold, rebuilding the bond becomes almost impossible, because the empath remembers every detail emotionally. They do not just remember the exact words spoken, but the behavioral patterns, the energy shifts, and the lack of consistency. Trust that has been broken repeatedly cannot be rebuilt with simple apologies. This is precisely why so many people panic after losing an empath from their lives. They arrogantly assume they can always win them back later when it suits them. But emotionally detached empaths rarely return in any real psychological way. Even if they happen to interact with you physically for a short period, emotionally, they have already left the building. That sudden realization creates a heavy regret that cuts far deeper than temporary anger ever could. Human beings frequently ignore true value while it is freely available right in front of them because only complete absence brings absolute clarity. This insight is not about creating fear, but about building genuine awareness. People must understand that empathetic individuals are not emotional sponges designed for endless sacrifice. They are human beings with real limits, self-respect, and boundaries. The more emotionally intelligent an empath becomes, the less tolerance they have for games disguised as love. If you have someone in your life who loves sincerely, listens deeply, supports you consistently, and stays patient during your worst moments, never take them for granted. Emotional safety is extraordinarily rare, and once you destroy it, you can never truly recreate it. An empath can easily survive and thrive without the people who mistreated them. But many people never truly recover from losing someone who deeply understood their soul. That is the ultimate irony of this dynamic. The empath that everyone underestimated becomes the one person they can never actually replace. By the time most people realize what they had, the empath has already moved on with their life, completely at peace with their decision. Most people completely misunderstand what happens inside an empath when they are hurt, because the internal damage is rarely visible in the beginning stages. An empath does not immediately turn cold, hostile, or distant. In fact, they often become even more patient, more understanding, and more available at first, because their natural instinct is to heal tension rather than create conflict. That is what makes the situation so deceptively dangerous for the other person. While others react instantly with anger or defense, empaths absorb emotional pain quietly and analyze it deeply from every angle. They replay conversations, analyze behavioral changes, notice inconsistencies, and try to convince themselves that things can still improve with time and effort. Empaths give second chances not out of weakness, but because they understand human flaws far better than most ever will. However, every single disappointment leaves a lasting psychological mark on their mind. Every ignored feeling, every subtle manipulation, and every moment of disrespect slowly exhausts their capacity to care. Over time, the empath enters a state of deep emotional fatigue, an exhausting condition where the mind grows completely tired of carrying weight for everyone else while receiving zero safety in return. This is the critical stage that most people fail to recognize, because the empath still appears perfectly calm on the outside. They continue to talk normally, help those around them, and maintain surface peace. But deep inside, something fundamental has shifted forever. The emotional energy that once flowed naturally toward you begins to dry up completely. Their trust becomes guarded, their openness closes down, and their mind deliberately shifts from deep attachment to neutral observation. Instead of chasing a broken bond, they quietly study the growing distance. This internal shift is incredibly important to grasp, because emotionally intelligent individuals do not leave impulsively or out of temporary anger. They detach after experiencing prolonged psychological disappointment. Once the empath realizes that their kindness is being continuously exploited rather than valued, their brain adapts specifically for self-protection. They stop explaining themselves over and over to people who choose not to listen. They stop reacting emotionally to every new problem that arises. They stop begging for simple honesty from adults who fully understand the damage they are causing. At this exact moment, many people foolishly assume the empath has settled down, when in reality they are mentally preparing to live without you entirely. The silence becomes noticeably heavier. The overall energy cools down, and the warmth that once filled every interaction slowly fades away. This is why people realize the true worth of an empath far too late in the process. They become so comfortable receiving endless support, patient listening, and unconditional grace that they mistake it as something permanent that requires no effort. People assume the empath will always be there regardless of how much pain they are forced to endure. But human psychology does not work that way indefinitely. Even the most compassionate heart reaches a point of total exhaustion. When an empath hits that absolute limit, the resulting detachment becomes practically impossible to undo, because it was built slowly over months of accumulated pain. By the time the empath emotionally steps away, they have already spent a long time grieving the relationship in complete silence. That is why their final departure feels so controlled, calm, and permanent. The actual emotional goodbye happened internally long before the physical separation ever took place. One of the biggest mistakes people make is assuming empathy equals weakness. Many believe that because an empath is patient, gentle, and forgiving, they can be pushed around without consequence. They mistake compassion for dependency and confuse kindness with a lack of awareness. But emotionally mature people operate on a level that manipulators rarely anticipate or understand. Empaths are constantly analyzing emotional patterns, even during moments when they say absolutely nothing. They catch tiny shifts in your voice, fake affection, passive disrespect, and subtle control tactics disguised as care. The real reason empaths tolerate bad behavior longer than most is not because they fail to see it, but because they naturally look for reasons behind human pain before making a final choice. They attempt genuine communication before closing the door for good. However, continuous emotional games change the dynamic entirely. When someone lies, manipulates, gaslights, or exploits an empath's big heart, the empath slowly realizes their energy is not building a real connection, but feeding toxic behavior. This single realization changes everything instantly. Instead of fighting harder or getting louder, the empath simply pulls their energy back. This is the exact moment where manipulation stops working completely. Toxic behavior relies entirely on having emotional access to you. It depends on triggering guilt, fear, confusion, and desperate chasing. A manipulator feels powerful only when they can control your emotional state at will. Once the empath stops reacting in those predictable ways, the manipulator loses all psychological control over the situation. That sudden, unexpected calmness confuses people because they mistake silence for surrender, when in reality, that silence is pure emotional liberation. The empath is no longer fighting to be understood because they finally understand the reality for themselves. Their entire focus shifts from trying to fix the relationship to protecting their own sanity and peace. This mindset shift is extraordinarily powerful because an emotionally detached person cannot be manipulated anymore. The empath stops seeking reassurance, stops arguing for basic respect, and stops sacrificing their mental health just to keep a toxic bond alive. They realize their peace is worth far more than any broken promise. And once that line is crossed, there is no turning back. You can try every old trick in the book, but an empath who has seen through the illusions will simply watch you in quiet detachment, fully aware of who you are and completely unbothered by your actions. When you reach that stage of clear seeing, the entire game dissolves. Toxic behavior requires a partner who is willing to stay trapped in the loop, constantly hoping for a different outcome while ignoring the reality right in front of them. The moment the empath steps out of that dynamic, the mirror turns back on the person trying to control them. Deprived of emotional reactions, the manipulator is forced to face their own internal noise, empty tactics, and deep-seated insecurity. This is precisely why the silent exit of an empath causes such intense panic. It leaves no room for debate, no space for twistings of the truth, and no energy left to drain. The conversation is over because the internal decision was already finalized with total clarity. What most people fail to understand is that an empath's silence is not a strategy to gain leverage or force you to change. It is simply the natural result of complete emotional burnout. They did not wake up one day and decide to become distant just to play mind games. They spent months, sometimes years, giving everything they had, constantly extending grace, overlooking red flags, and absorbing pain in the hope that genuine connection would prevail. Every time they brought up an issue, they were offering a roadmap to heal the relationship. Every time they expressed their feelings, they were inviting real honesty. But when those attempts are met with deflection, dismissiveness, or superficial promises, the empath's mind eventually recognizes that the effort is entirely one-sided. The silent retreat is not a punishment directed at you, it is a quiet act of self-preservation. Once Once an empath reaches this level of emotional discipline, their entire perspective on human relationships undergoes a massive upgrade. They no longer measure the value of a bond by how long they have known someone or how much history they share. Instead, they look at consistency, respect, safety, and mutual effort. The charm, polished words, and grand gestures that once might have swayed them no longer hold any currency. They have learned the hard way that talk is cheap and that true character is revealed through consistent action over time. This makes an evolved empath remarkably clear-headed. They can admire someone's potential while completely rejecting their destructive behavior. They can hold deep compassion for your struggles without allowing your chaos to wreck their inner peace. This ultimate shift in awareness is what makes a healed empath practically untouchable to manipulative dynamics. They no longer fear being alone because they have learned that solitude is infinitely more peaceful than staying in environments where their boundaries are constantly tested. They do not crave validation from people who are incapable of showing real respect. When you lose an empath who loved you deeply, you do not just lose a person. You lose the rare, safe harbor they created for you in a chaotic world. They were the one person who truly listened without judgment, who saw your worth even when you struggled to see it yourself, and who offered genuine warmth without asking for anything unreasonable in return. Once that unique light goes dark in your life, no amount of regret, excuses, or late realizations can bring back the warmth that was so carelessly thrown away.